I've owned, ridden, and loved this Honda CRF 300L Rally for 2 years now. I think it's one of the best bikes ever made. If you're in the market for a 300L, or it's even something you're considering on your list, and you should be, because it's a great bike, here are 9 things you should know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally. Before we jump in, I just want to say thank you to MotoCamp Nerd for sponsoring this video. We'll talk about his most recent unfortunate mishap in a bit. I think my biggest misconception before I got this bike, and admittedly, I bought this bike to make content on it, not because I was super excited about it. My answer when someone asked me about the Rally, whether it was the 250 or the 300, was always, why would you buy that bike with extra fairings, extra weight, extra top heaviness, when you can just get a 250L or a 300L and do all the same things? I thought it was just a heavier, less capable version of the 300 or the 250L. And when I got my hands on this thing, I realized quickly that is not the case. I was wrong. In fact, that's what my first ride video, the thumbnail says, I was wrong, in giant letters, because this thing feels exactly like a dual sport. It feels like a 300L. I was just amazed at how much it is definitely a dual sport. It rides like a dual sport. It's capable like a dual sport. It feels like a dual sport. Obviously, it doesn't feel like a big, heavy adventure bike, but I don't really notice the extra 1.5 gallons of gas. The extra fairings never hit the ground anyway because I have hand guards. That was the first thing, the biggest surprise, I think, when I got this, and the biggest misconception I was laboring under, was that it was dramatically different or really different at all from a 300L, and it is technically on paper, but it doesn't feel like it once you swing your leg over. Number 2 thing you should know before you buy a CRF 300L, it is not useless on the highway. Is it my first choice for 7 hours of freeway riding? No. But I have taken this thing up and over mountain passes. I have done 3-4 hours on it on the highway to get home from a trip or to get to a trip. I pass people just like I have on every other bike, maybe not as quickly. You got to plan ahead a little bit. It's like a KLR that way. Our friend Critter Moto has a 250L that he rides from Canada to Oregon and back every year. He's got tens of thousands of miles on that thing. Itchy Boots obviously rode a 300L all over the world. This idea that you can't ride it on the highway or that it's useless on the highway or too uncomfortable to ride on the highway is false. It's not the most comfortable bike to ride on the highway, but it's fine. I think a lot of that comes from the 250L. 250L was a lot harder to ride on the highway. 6th gear was pretty much useless. It was hard to maintain 70 miles an hour, but I don't have any problems doing 70 miles an hour on this bike. I just rode with the Rocky Mountain ATV guys for a few days in Death Valley, up and over, the crazy elevation changes and tons of mileage. Everything's super far apart out there, and I kept up with the group the whole time. So don't let that stop you from considering one or buying one. The number 3 thing to know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally is that the stock suspension is pretty soft. It's pretty terrible. And it's probably my least favorite thing about this bike. The second least favorite thing about this bike in stock form is the stock tires. They are not good. So stock suspension is weak. It is soft. It's divey. Now, you hear me saying that, and that's from the perspective of an experienced rider. If you're a new rider just getting your feet wet, you won't notice the difference. It does make it more comfortable on the road, so it's a good bike to start on, and that soft suspension also makes it so that even though the seat height is like 36 inches, a little lower than that, if you throw your leg over, the sag from the suspension being a little softer helps you get your feet down easier. So suspension is a weak point, but it's not a deal breaker. Stock tires, however, I would strongly advise you to go out and replace them immediately with D-Sports or Trackmasters. You can spend $100, $120 and get a decent set of tires for this thing. The stock tires are cheap, they're hard compound, they look knobby enough, but they're terrible on anything more difficult than gravel, honestly. They're no good in the mud, they're no good in the sand. I experienced both on my 250L. The biggest weakness of this bike, particularly compared to other similar bikes, is that stock suspension is garbage. Second biggest weakness is that stock tires are garbage, and you don't have to take my word for it. Our friend MotoCamp Nerd, Ben, just bought one of these bikes, and he took it out on his first trip into the mud, crashed because the stock tires suck, and fractured his knee. And I really tried hard to resist the temptation to say, I told you so, but a little tiny one did squeak through. But mostly sympathy with like a 2%, I told you so. Speaking of MotoCamp Nerd, did you know that MotoCamp Nerd is your one-stop shop on the internet for all of your motorcycle camping needs? The world's largest, carefully curated selection. Every item is specially chosen by Ben for motorcycle camping. There's no other site like that on the internet that I'm aware of. And now he's also selling riding gear, so you can pick up climb riding gear from him. He's branching out from just motorcycle camping to some motorcycle adventures in general. general as well. So even though it is colder weather and you're maybe not thinking about camping as much, you can go over there, check out riding gear, and he's also selling hippo hands and other cold weather riding essentials. So pop over to the site, check that out. I know it's winter and foggy and it looks like garbage weather here, but this is the perfect time to start planning those spring adventures and summer adventures, start daydreaming about them, and to start getting your gear figured out and purchased and ready for next year's adventures. So pop over to the website, check out MotoCampNerd.com. Ben is a friend, sponsor of this channel, and I really want to support him in his dream of making that his full-time job. Thing number 4 to know about the CRF 300L Rally is that if you have a choice between a 250L Rally and a 300L Rally and you're thinking the 250L is cheaper, I should just pick that up, the 300L is definitely worth it over the 250L in my experience. My first dual sport was a 250L. I have a ton of experience with the 250L. I have a ton of experience with the limitations of the 250L. And honestly, when they announced that they were upgrading it to a 300, I was like, whoop-de-doo, 50 cc's, that's not gonna make any difference. But then I got my hands on one and it makes a massive difference. The extra horsepower comes in exactly where it counts and where you need it. The biggest weakness of the 250L, in my opinion, was 55 to 60 and beyond. The extra 50 cc's really make this bike capable of cruising at 60, 65, 70 miles an hour in a way that the 250L wasn't. The 250L was no good on the highway, and I wouldn't really recommend it to you if you are taking it on long highway drives, our friend Moto notwithstanding, but the 300L is a massive upgrade, particularly if you're gonna spend any time on the road, and the extra power isn't bad off-road either. Worthwhile upgrade over the 250L. I would strongly encourage you to get a 300 if you're trying to choose between the two. Number 5 thing to know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally, it is unique. There is no other bike like this on the market. In terms of a 330-pound bike that has adventure style trappings like the windscreen and the bigger fuel tank, there's no other bike like this. You can get adventure bikes that have some of that stuff, but they all weigh 100 pounds more at least. This is, as far as I can tell, the only factory light adventure bike you can buy, or the only one that I would consider in terms of a bike under 400 pounds, under 350 pounds, fully set up for you to throw your leg over and go on an adventure. The extra gas in the fuel tank, the fairing, they make a big difference, and I think really do transform this from dual sport into light adventure bike. I go into that in more detail in my full review, which you can check out above. Number 6 thing to know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally, one of the biggest things I see, one of the concerns, one of the first comments you see if you talk about buying one of these online is, oh, it's super heavy. It is 331 pounds or 335 pounds for the ABS model. That's heavy for a dual sport if you're comparing it to a 500 EXCF at 247 pounds. It's not that heavy for a Japanese dual sport, for one of these dual sports with a street engine, the more beginner friendly, the more general use versus specific trail weapon bikes. The DRZ 400S was 319 pounds, I'm pretty sure, right in that 320 pound range. It's not heavy for a dual sport. It's a little heavy, I'll give you that, 10 pounds heavier than a lot of dual sports, but they all come in around that 300 pound range. And like I said before, you don't really notice the extra weight, but you will notice the extra fuel capacity. So don't let this "it's too heavy" crap dissuade you, because it's still 100, 150 pounds lighter than most of the adventure bikes out there. You're gonna be far more confident taking on hard stuff and picking it up by yourself than you would be on any adventure bike, even the lightest weight entry-level one that exists. Number 7 thing to know before you buy a 300L Rally, it is the perfect bike for adventure rallies. I know, shocking for a bike with the word rally in the name, but this is my favorite bike to take to events like Touratech, Giant Loop. I took this thing all the way to South Dakota for the Get On ADV Fest because it's light enough to go on the hitch carrier or easy enough to put in the back of your truck. It's capable and lightweight and confidence-inspiring off-road, so when you go to a rally you've never been to before, you don't know what kind of terrain you're going to encounter. So I like to be on the lightest, most capable bike I have. That is this bike right now, at least compared to like the 790 and the other bikes in the garage. The other thing is, unlike the other dual sports where if you take one, like a KLX 300, you take it to a rally, you're gonna be butt puckered about fuel range the whole time. I've got 3.5 gallons. I have 150 miles of fuel range. That is exceptional for a dual sport. I get the ease of riding and the confidence of tackling uncertain terrain without fuel anxiety. It's the perfect bike to take to adventure rallies and spend your days riding, and that is why it is most often the bike you'll see on my hitch carrier when I'm headed to a rally. Number 8 thing to know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally, and this mildly contradicts my number 1, but not really. The extra fairing, that is all of this from here forward does make it kind of a pain in the ass to work on sometimes. It sucks to get at anything underneath here because this is all one piece. It doesn't come apart and it's covering a lot of the general engine stuff. So here back is normal, just like any other dual sport, but from there forward, particularly if you add crash bars to the mix, which I honestly, as much as I love Outback Motortech, do not recommend because they never hit the ground anyway, because my handguards hit the ground most of the time. The extra fairing does make it a little bit harder to work on sometimes, depending on what you're doing, things like running wires to the battery and anything you need to do to get underneath there. So just know it will take some extra steps if you're planning on working on it yourself. The engine and the innards are not as easy to get to as a typical dual sport because of that extra fairing. Now, the concern about breaking the extra plastics and it costing a lot of money has been largely unfounded because I've dropped it a ton of times. Yes, I have crash bars, but they never even hit the ground. It's always the handguards. I wouldn't be too concerned about messing up the fairing, but just know that it is in the way sometimes when you're trying to work on the bike. And the number 9 thing to know before you buy a CRF 300L Rally is that it might just be the best first entry-level, beginner, all-around dual sport or adventure bike ever. If you're looking to dip your toe into the world of on and off-road hybrid riding, whether that's dual sport, adventure riding, whatever you want to call it, if you want to ride on the pavement and then leave the pavement, it might be the best first bike for that ever made. And it's unique, and that's what makes it so special. Admittedly, it's a little tall for a new rider, but for a dual sport, it's not super tall. It's like a 35.5-inch seat height, and with the sag of the stock suspension, it's a blessing and a curse, but when you throw your leg over, you will gain back an inch or two of that. So it's not as high as it looks. It's intimidating, but put your foot on the peg, swing your leg over, and let the suspension sag down. That was one of my biggest concerns on the 250L until I sat on it, and then I was like, oh, but it's not that big a deal. It's easy enough to ride off-road, even when you're first beginning. It's forgiving of mistakes. It doesn't really have enough power to do things like wheelie out from underneath you or slide out from underneath you. It's easy to ride. It's smooth. It's one of the smoothest riding motorcycles I've ever ridden. I love this thing. It's smooth like Barry White and Lando Calrissian had a baby smooth. It's cheap enough that most people can afford it. It's cheap enough that you don't cry when you drop it. And the insurance is stupid cheap. I pay $96 a year. Admittedly, I'm old and married, but $96 a year for full coverage and a $0 deductible on this bike. The cost of ownership of this bike is so low because you're changing the oil once a year, maybe twice a year if you're crazy. That's not expensive. It lasts a long time. Insurance is cheap. It gets 50 miles to the gallon with me on it, supposedly up to 70, though I've never seen that. It's a cheap and easy bike to maintain, cheap and reliable bike to own, one of the most reliable bikes out there because it's a Honda. It's easy enough to ride at the beginning, forgiving, but has enough power to take you all the way out on all of your adventures. You could ride to a BDR and ride a BDR on this. I think the ultimate beginner bike in my mind is one that is easy enough that it's not dangerous or intimidating for a new rider, but you can keep riding it up until the time that you're ready for your first multi-day trip with a ton of miles camping off of it. I've done parts of the Oregon BDR solo on this with camping gear. I think it's a great bike for that. And while I don't love the idea of riding it 7 hours to the beginning of some BDR, I would. So I think it's a great beginner bike that can last you a super long time. It can be your forever bike. It's just because it's beginner friendly doesn't mean it's not good for experienced riders. And the only Achilles heel here is the suspension, but a new rider doesn't know the difference. And by the time you start to notice the difference and ride hard enough to bottom it out, you're gonna be ready to upgrade that suspension or upgrade the bike anyway. So I don't think it's a deal breaker at all. And the most important piece of data really to verify that it is the best entry-level dual sport, beginner dual sport ever, is that weird Dork in the Road guy put it at the top of his dual sport beginner tier list, which you can check out right up here. So what do you think? Do you own a CRF 300L? What do people need to know before they buy one, before they consider buying one? I couldn't recommend this bike more highly. I love this bike. It's the bike I've held on to the longest. It's a bike that's gonna be in my garage, I think, for a while. I always say that, but this one, 2 years. I have no intentions of selling it because it's always there when I need it, no matter what else is in the garage. And I would be comfortable taking it on pretty much anything, pretty much anywhere. If you want to see more dual sport and adventure content, please consider subscribing to the channel because I'm the Dork on the Road and I want to be your internet riding buddy. Big shout out and thank you to MotoCamp Nerd for sponsoring this video. Pop over and check out the site if you're looking for motorcycle camping stuff or motorcycle gear or anything really motorcycle or adventure related. He's going to have it. I'll leave a link to that in the description. But for now, and as always, I just want to say thank you very much for watching and please do not forget to be excellent to each other. Thank you.
Excellent!